Hello, and thank you very much for coming along again. This evening we want to look at the problem of endangered species because there are a whole series of new measures taken by the current administration that place endangered species in real danger, including ourselves. In fact, the human species is becoming an endangered species, and the policies that are being pursued at this point by the current administration are placing us in more and more vulnerable circumstances. So we want to look particularly at what's called the devastating new proposals that endanger vulnerable species, including ourselves. This isn't some hypothetical, it's happening now. And the proposals to forward it came forward this last week in a public forum. Much attention, of course, has been focused on the environmentally destructive behavior of former EPA Administrator Scott Pruitt, but he's hardly alone. In fact, the whole Trump agenda expands over all of the departments and secretariats. Within EPA, Pruitt's enduring legacies include pesticides in your food, pesticides that are poisoning agricultural workers, pesticides that kill vital pollinators, the very insects that we need as allies in the agricultural system, the ones that carry pollen from blossom to blossom, pesticides in public water supplies. All of these chemicals, which have done special deals with Pruitt in order to get delisted or unregulated during his time. There is also increased fracking, polluting water supplies, both in Pennsylvania, Texas, and elsewhere where it's practiced rather universally without the adequate protections to capture the chemically laden water that streams from these power underground blasting sites. There's an increased lead pollution in urban water supplies around the country, making Flint look much worse. First of all, it's worse in Flint than we have ever been told, and that information is coming out now. But in addition, urban water supplies are, in comparison with Flint, even worse in some cases. And there's been toxic chemicals released into the environment while information is suppressed about that release. And the public's been kept in the dark, either because journalists have been barred from the hearings about that, or because they've been doing it without any fear, corporations, of the enforcement of existing laws. But Scott Pruitt's not the only source of destructive environmental action in the Trump administration. Meet Mike, as it were, Ryan Zinke. Ryan Zinke, Secretary of the Interior, the man Trump chose to administer federal lands and national parks, is really at the center of this week's headlines because of what he's started to do. But let's take a look back at before he took the office and was being considered for the position. It's very
objectively, no question, the best thing about America is our national parks. From Yellowstone to the Great Smoky Mountains to the Grand Canyon and the giant redwoods, America is dotted with these just breathtaking pieces of land.
And all the national parks are managed by this one department, the Department of the Interior. Actually, it manages a bunch of other lands too, adding up to about 1/5 of the entire United States. And that includes 56 million acres of tribal lands.
You could say it's pretty important. So currently, about 30% of the nation's energy production takes place on these federal lands, but they also serve as wilderness refuges, tribal lands, grazing areas, and sites for logging and mining.
So the man Donald Trump has asked to run this department is Montana Congressman Ryan Zinke.
Our future Secretary of the Interior says he sees the value of federal lands.
Make no mistake, I do not and I will not tolerate selling our public lands.
He's an avid outdoorsman and a fan of Teddy Roosevelt, and that's a good sign, at least when it comes to conservation. However, despite what he says about public lands, in January, Zinke voted with the House to make these lands much easier to sell. He'll also oversee the Bureau of Indian Affairs reservation land, which some advisors to the Trump team want to privatize. Zinke himself has a mixed record when it comes to tribal sovereignty, and the Bureau could play a key role in changing the way tribal lands are or aren't protected.
Plus, his biggest campaign contributor, surprise, it's an oil company. Early on, it looks like we'll see more drilling and mining with the new Department of the Interior.
That's the understatement. He's not in favor of selling the lands, because why sell it when you can sell the rights to lease it? You don't own the land, you leave all the waste behind, you just extract the resources. Not interested in selling the land, they'll just sell the lease to all the resources within it. And that's what he's done in an extraordinary way. Secretary Zinke has moved, in effect, to expand drilling and exploitation on lands under his control, including Indian lands. And that's absolutely crucial. He's not alone in this. Before President Trump, President Obama expanded the use of American federal lands and offshore drilling rights especially. We talked about that earlier back in 2012 in a program called Drilling, Spilling, and Killing, the business as usual versus clean energy future. Obama wanted a business as usual and more of the above approach. You can look at that program online and catch up. But take a look at the ideology of extractivism that's really behind the new chapter in the Trump-Zinke moment. Take a look.
In the midst of the sixth great extinction, corporate greed, political corruption, and state-sanctioned violence rise like the oceans. Society and our climate continue to spiral into chaos. Economic and ecological storms grow stronger and more destructive. Our freedoms and security rush down the drain towards extinction like so many of Earth's rapidly dying species. For decades, fossil fuel infrastructure has expanded across all parts of the globe. Most of human society has become dependent on oil to complete even the most menial tasks. In what could be the final centuries of human history, corporate and state power have merged together to secure the world's last remaining oil reserves. The same destructive colonial mindset brought by Columbus still thrives today, printed behind the badges of law and hidden within the shadowy boardrooms of monolithic energy corporations. Oil pumps through the swollen veins of capitalism as pipelines snake through the communities across the Americas on its way to export. Thousands of years of indigenous history and the very fate of humanity remain under threat of total annihilation as corporations move to extract the final dollar. In a world saturated with oil wars and disasters, hope is slowly being asphyxiated through the tightening grip of the black snake.
The Black Snake. Well, it's a movie. In fact, it's a documentary now revealing, in effect, the corporate and governmental collaboration to extract the last barrel of oil, the last ton of carbon, the last cubic foot of natural gas. Well, what's happening to biodiversity in all of this is even more depressing in a way. Take a look.
Last week, the Trump administration unveiled a plan to gut the Endangered Species Act. the ESA. This law, which Richard Nixon signed in 1973, was passed by Congress almost unanimously. It is said to have protected over 1,600 species from extinction, including the bald eagle, the spotted owl, and the grizzly bear. According to the Ohio State University opinion poll, 84% of U.S. citizens support the ESA, including 74% of conservatives. Still, the Trump administration argues that the way the law is being implemented slows economic growth, especially the Interior Department of Ryan Zinke, who is Secretary Ryan Zinke, is telling the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration to take economic impacts into consideration when deciding which species to protect.
Yes, don't protect those that don't have an economic value. Anything that interferes with human economic profit making isn't going to be considered endangered anymore. This is really the abandonment of science altogether, and the rewarding of
The Trump administration has announced plans to gut the Endangered Species Act, ordering federal agencies to consider economic impacts before listing animals to be protected under the law. The newly proposed guidelines by the Interior Department would allow corporations involved in mining, drilling, or other forms of extraction to proceed with projects that would otherwise be prohibited. Republican President Richard Nixon signed the Endangered Species Act in 1973 to provide a framework to conserve and protect endangered and threatened species and their habitats. The Trump administration's proposed rules are among several recent efforts to weaken the Endangered Species Act. Earlier this month, the Congressional Western Caucus introduced a package of 9 bills to, quote, modernize the ESA.
For more, we're joined by Karen Suckling. He is executive director, founder of the Center for Biological Diversity, the group that has sued the Trump administration 81 times over the past year and a half. Karen, welcome to Democracy Now! Talk about what is happening to the Endangered Species Act 45 years after it was passed and President Nixon signed off on it.
Yeah, the Trump administration's proposal to gut the Endangered Species Act is the most comprehensive, devastating attempt to destroy this law we've seen in this entire time. And this is after Reagan and after the Bushes. It's even worse than that. It's quite extraordinary.
Well, and specifically, how would the weakening or gutting of the act work if it went through?
Well, it will strip protection entirely for about 60% of all the species on the list. And these are the species that are listed as threatened rather than endangered. Currently, they get essentially the same protection as endangered species. Under the Trump proposal, they would get no protection at all. You could continue to kill them. You could continue to destroy their habitat as if they were simply not protected.
Take a look. It's really quite dramatic as a series of measures, and one that's going to be remembered with bitterness by large percentages of the American population. It's being presented as a states' rights issue, empowering local states.
The discussion draft elevates the role of states in partnering with the federal government to implement the Endangered Species Act. It affords states the opportunity to lead wildlife conservation efforts, including through the establishment of recovery teams for listed species and developing and implementing recovery plans. It provides for increased regulatory certainty, so stakeholders are incentivized to enter into voluntary conservation and recovery activities. It increases transparency. It codifies a system for prioritizing species listing petitions, so limited resources flow to the species most in need.
Karen Suckling, if you can respond to what Republican Senator John Barrasso of Wyoming was saying.
Yeah, this is really extraordinary because to get onto the endangered species list, the there first has to be a finding that state plans have not worked, that state plans have caused the species to be imperiled. And so now Brazos wants to have the law say, oh, well, let's put the states whose plans failed in charge of conserving the species. How can that make any sense at all? He wants to do that because he knows the states don't have the money, the infrastructure, and in places like Idaho, Utah, Alaska, they don't have the desire to protect these species. It's the reason they're endangered in the first place, right? We don't turn over implementation of our laws to criminals who've just been found guilty of breaking the law. The state can be a partner of the federal government. The federal government needs to set the standards, provide the funds to get the job done that the states failed to do.
And Karen Suckling, why do you? What's your sense of why the Trump administration is making this such a priority? I mean, President Trump is not exactly known as a guy who has a lot of concern about what's going on with nature or with the open spaces of America. He's a real estate developer. So why do you think he has moved so aggressively on this front?
Well, he's being strongly influenced by right-wing Republican congressmen, but especially those from the western states where so much logging, mining, grazing, oil drilling, coal mining is taking place on public lands. And there's this right-wing agenda to allow our public lands to be turned over to industry groups.
That's it. This isn't states' rights in any real sense, because these are unfunded mandates for the states. Tell the states to do it, and then you realize it can't be done. States are not thought to be a valid conductor of policy when that policy exceeds what the government wants to do. Take a look at what they're doing in California and trying to reverse what the state has been doing.
Well, you mentioned greenhouse gas emissions, but the Trump administration is also seeking to revoke California's authority to set its own tougher automobile emission standards. On Tuesday, acting EPA Administrator Andrew Wheeler said the U.S. needs a single standard for fuel efficiency for cars and trucks.
Yeah, this is really outrageous because the way our Clean Air Act worked is it allows states to set standards if they're higher than the federal government. And so for 48 years running now, California has had a higher standard. It's had that through administrations, Democratic and Republican, conservative and liberal. No one's had a problem with it until Trump. And so partly this is his efforts to reduce any attempt to control global warming, but it's also clearly a personal agenda to attack California, which he believes is just generally a hostile element to him personally. And so consequently, we have this incredible irrational act, especially when, for example, we got Brazos talking about states' rights, let's empower the states. Well, these Republicans only want to empower the states when the states have a lower protective standard. The second a state has a higher standard, all of a sudden all concerns about state rights go out the window, and we have to go to a federal single authority that's going to reduce environmental protection.
Karen, what about the record of the Interior Secretary, Ryan Zinke?
Well, I urge you to find out about that in these webcasts and look at what local commentators are saying.
Take a look at this. It's a majestic creature known as the American red wolf. And if Donald Trump and Republicans in Congress have their way, the U.S. government will no longer try to keep it from going extinct. According to the New York Times, in the past 2 weeks, Trump and his allies in Congress have put forward or voted on more than 24 pieces of legislation, policy initiatives, and amendments designed to weaken the Endangered Species Act. That's right, the Endangered Species Act has now endangered itself. And these wolves are just one species of dozens now threatened that are likely going to be at greater risk of extinction if these proposals go through. The administration wants to make it easier to delist a species as endangered or threatened, no longer protect animals listed as threatened in the future at the same level as endangered species, and to remove barriers to assessing the cost of conservation, which can make it easier for construction projects to get approval despite environmental concerns. And talk about chutzpah. One of these proposals was even attached to a defense authorization bill named for ailing veteran Senator John McCain, a longtime defender of the Endangered Species Act. Under the revisions, the administration would also stop considering areas for protected habitats if species with dwindling populations were to recover. Brett Hartle from the Center for Biological Diversity told The Independent it would amount to a death sentence for polar bears. Not to mention other laws specifically targeting animals like the red wolf, the prairie chicken, and the burying beetle, which, according to the Times, have the misfortune to live on lands oil and gas companies want to drill on.
That's the point. If there are any species on these lands, they want to get rid of them, basically, get them out of the way. The new policies represent a large-scale assault on all species, including ourselves. No species can survive in a destroyed life support system, including ourselves. And although Nixon, a Republican president, initiated this in 1973, the current-day Republican administration is eviscerating it, in fact, totally destroying the Endangered Species Act. Humans will not be able to survive with a destroyed life support system, and we're already seeing this with floods and droughts, disasters, and extreme weather events. Things like this are ironic. I don't believe in global warming, it says on the wall. You don't need to believe in it. You're going to be hit by it anyway. Sea level is rising, whether you believe it or not. This is an administration that's resolutely marching in the wrong direction and taking the entire country with it. It's for this reason that we need to start rethinking these questions of whether we should let an administration get away with this kind of rip-roaring rehab, and in fact, rip-roaring devastation of existing protections of the environment and the species that inhabit it. This is why there's a new alliance emerging around the world between citizens and scientists.
This is Noam Chomsky. You're watching Cambridge Community TV.